Okay, so now that we know how stocks and bonds are initially issued, um, and how they make their way into the financial markets, now we are ready to talk about bonds. And I have to confess that when I was in business school, in my MBA program, I found this stuff incredibly confusing. Um, and when I read through your book, I see why, right? These textbooks don't do a very good job of giving context, I don't think. So that's why I did chapter 15 a little bit first. And I'm going to kind of take a step back and do a whole big sort of preamble before we start diving into what the textbook says, because I hope that will make it a little bit less, a little bit more understandable than just going strictly on what the textbook is telling us. So in chapter 6, we're gonna go through. We're gonna learn some lingo, learn the terminology, and learn how they're priced. And then we're going to talk about some of the impact of having non-annual coupon payments, they're called. I'll get to that. And again, we're going to look at some of the relationships between the pricing, the elements of an equation for pricing bonds, and then talk about bond ratings. We are not going to get into bond history because life is too short for that for me. And then we're just going to briefly touch on some very, very important bonds in our economy that are issued by the federal government. Okay, so that's where we are going to go with this. So let's dive in. So the first portion of this chapter sort of throws out a bunch of terminology, and before we get into that, I want to kind of go through just a little bit of remembering where we were, right? So I took a bunch of notes here and then I put them in white font so you can't see them until I go to talk about them. That's my special Excel whiteboard trick. Okay, so what is a bond? Let's back up a little bit. What the heck is a bond anyways, right? So remember, it is a long-term debt obligation. Quite often bonds are 30-year maturities, and they are usually issued when a corporation or a government needs to make major capital investments. Things like schools, bridges, roads, buildings, major capital investments, new power plants, things like that, right? So one of the basic rules of finance is that you want to match the length of your obligation to the length of the investment. So you don't take on long-term debt to pay for short-term expenditures. You don't use short-term. I've seen so many businesses go down because of this. You don't use short-term financing to pay for long-term investments. And so if you've got a building that's going to last for 30 years, take on a 30-year bond issue, right? So after the company or the government entity initially issues the bonds, then it just becomes a financial instrument that's bought and sold in financial markets, just like stocks are. And I want to note that when a government or a business issues a bond, it's basically taking on a loan. It takes on an obligation to pay back its creditors, just like a normal loan from the company's point of view, right? So I issue $50 million worth of bonds at 7%. I've got to pay 7% of $50 million every year, right? So the company promises to pay interest at a certain rate for a certain number of years. And then at the end, it pays back the principal too. So if we want to look at an example, right, a company borrows $1,000 for 10 years at a 7% interest rate, which is called a coupon rate in bond lingo. And if they pay it back annually, then the cash flow that we're looking at for each year, we can make a timeline just like we do for our normal time value of money equations, right? And so we've got $70 coming each year, year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., all the way through year 10, and then in year 10, the cash flow is 1,070. So this is just, just like any other investment. It's an annuity. And so we can value that, right? We are buying that series of cash flows, just like when we were talking about buying any other investment in the last unit. And so we can just value it. I can find where I wrote it. We can value it at the present value of the future cash flows, discounted at some appropriate discount rate. This is just a simple present value question, right? And so the present value of that bond, discounted at 5%, is $1,154.43. So if you discount all these cash flows back to the present at 5%, right, and you have to use a function in Excel called NPV, which is the present value of uneven cash flows, that gives you a present value of $1,154. So someone would pay $1,154.43 if their discount rate was 5%. Right? So we know how to do this already. And so now that we have a little bit of background as to sort of the general direction that we're going in bonds, right? Now we can kind of maybe look at some of the specialized vocabulary and kind of get our heads around what is being talked about in this very, very important financial instrument. So, the components of a bond, and what I'm gonna do is scroll down a little bit to show you an actual, like, physical corporate bond and what it looks like. Okay, so there's all these words over here: coupon rate, maturity date, yield to maturity, Fitch ratings, frequency, the type, and is it callable, right? So this is what a bond looks like, and it contains all the information that is needed in order to determine whether it's a good investment or not today as it's being sold. So scrolling back up again then, let's look at these vocabulary words. So the par value of a bond is the principal amount that the corporation pays at the bond's maturity. So in this case, not surprisingly, right, I gave you this little example of a $1,000 bond. In this case, the $1,000 is the par value. And then the coupon rate is that 7% that you're going to get paid every year. And one of the things that becomes really confusing about bonds is you've got two different relevant interest rates here, right? The coupon rate is the interest that the borrower is paying. Okay, so it's that 7% coupon here, and that's the payment here. The maturity date is the date when the corporation makes the final interest payment. So in our example, it was in year 10. So 10 years out from whatever the initial issue date was. And of course, when you're buying bonds out in financial markets, you're not buying them on the day they're issued, right? You might buy it, in year 6 of the whole life of the bond, right? If you were, then you would value that investment at this point here, and just discount these future payments. But we'll get to that later in the chapter. Now the yield to maturity, or the yield on the bond, is the discount rate or the investment value of that bond. If I invested $1,154.43 to get this stream of cash flows, that would imply that I was getting a 5% return, right? And so that's what all the relevant vocabulary words mean at this point for bonds. So here's a table that provides some information about bond prices and the coupon rate, maturity, and the yield. Don't worry about the current yield, as is the case in so many things. You've provided more information that you really need. But one thing that I want to notice, look at the relationship between the yield to maturity and the rating levels for these bonds. But in this case, as you move down from AAA to Bs and down into Cs, the sort of the likelihood of this cash flow stream actually coming to pass goes down. And we will discuss that relationship between return and riskiness at great length in the next module. All these things are totally interrelated, right? So scrolling down a little bit, then as we go into how your textbook suggests pricing the bond. So I showed you how to do it by by just doing the NPV function on this series of cash flows here, and NPV is just how Excel applies a present value function to an uneven series of cash flows. But let's go ahead and take and set this bond over here up in the way that your book likes to see it. Just scrolling down to get the left-hand side right. So we've got rate and number of periods, payments, future value, and the type, and the present value. So let's see. Make a little box. Okay, so going up to the information that's provided on the bond, then we have got a yield to maturity of 5.3%, so that's our rate, 0.053. Our number of periods was, it looks like 10 years. The payment is going to be the coupon rate times the par value, and we are going to assume that this is a $1,000 bond, right? So our payment is going to be 0.065 times 1,000. Oops. $65. So we're going to have a positive value of $65. And then our future value is going to be $1,000. The type is 0. And so then we can just use our present value function and just go right through here. So the present value of the rate, and the number of periods of 10, and there it is, 1,091.33. So that's how much this Merrill Lynch bond was worth, right? And you can calculate that, by hand, or you can use a financial calculator, or you can use a spreadsheet. So that's how you price a bond. And the key to it all is keeping straight in your head the difference between the yield to maturity and the coupon rate. Okay, so I'll stop here and then we'll move to the next section of the chapter.